Welcome to the layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 11. A way to remember this psalm is with the phrase, trapped birds, because the psalm starts with fear that David and his court are hopelessly besieged, like trapped birds. But a mighty reversal happens by the end. The psalm has three main sections: the human perspective on the siege, a godly perspective, and finally, a summary. Like so many psalms, this one was written by David, and at some point arranged for the music director for worship in the temple. We sometimes find that psalms that seem to have arisen from a particular circumstance are generalized to be more widely applicable and more suitable for temple worship. This means it may require significant analysis to understand what first prompted the psalm, but the real point of the psalm is no longer tethered to those initial circumstances, as it has become more generally applicable. The first section of the psalm represents the human perspective on what we will see is a frightening situation of siege that seems near to catastrophic overthrow. David begins by saying, "I have sought refuge in the Lord." How can you say to me, "Flee to your mountains, birds"? In the ancient Near East, bird imagery is associated with siege warfare. To call a besieged king a bird was to mock him as trapped and helpless. To speak of a king fleeing like birds to their mountains could be a taunt, implying that they run away because they are powerless to stay and fight. See our Poetic Features video for more on this. In this case, it would seem that David's own men speak of him as birds, meaning his situation is so desperate that the only possible action is to flee. Their reasoning follows. Verse 2 begins a play-by-play account, reenacting the progress of the siege. Some background knowledge on archery in the ancient world is necessary. Bows would normally be stored unstrung, and when about to be used, the archers would first need to bend and string the bow, then put the arrow in place, and then shoot the arrow. This sequence is important. Bend, string, put arrows on, and then shoot. For look, the wicked people are about to bend the bow. They've put their arrows in place on the string in order to shoot in deep darkness at the upright in heart. By listing out the separate steps of bending the bow and then putting arrows in place, the poem generates high tension as the attack is about to begin. The fear is that David and his men will be unable to resist the attack, so defeat is sure. The idea of shooting an arrow in deep darkness is not entirely clear. Given what comes next in the psalm, it would seem the darkness refers to the inability of the defenders to see and protect themselves, rather than to specific circumstances for archers. A calamity is intended for those who are upright in heart, and it's terrifying. Things get even worse in verse 3. There is more siege imagery, this time of the attacking army tunneling under the city wall, to both gain access for the enemy and sometimes causing the city wall itself to collapse. This was called destroying the foundations. When the foundations are destroyed, there is no hope left of resisting the invading army. For the foundations are about to be destroyed. What has the righteous person done? All hope is about to disappear. For those depending on a higher authority to deliver them, it implicitly questions whether or not that higher authority is able or willing to deliver them. The question, "What has the righteous person done?" expresses the frustration that the righteous, God's people, have not done anything to merit God's abandoning them to this siege. In other words, God should have come to deliver them by now, so they would not be at the mercy of their attackers. They don't deserve this. The implication is that it is no longer clear whether or not God will be loyal to his covenant people. It looks as if he might not. The advisors have finished speaking, and now David provides his own perspective, which accounts for what the Lord is doing, even if his advisors cannot see it. In spite of their fear and doubt, the Lord has not been ignoring his people, nor has he been ignoring his responsibilities to act righteously. Instead, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord, his throne is in heaven. His eyes observe. His eyelids test humans. The Lord is not absent, but reigning in holiness from his temple. His throne, his seat of authority, is not subject to the difficulties of earth. In order to act righteously, to execute justice, the Lord must know who is righteous and who is wicked. He will not act in darkness as the wicked do. That's why his eyes observe and test humans, just like a smith tests a precious metal to determine its quality. Testing in the Old Testament usually has this twofold sense of assessing quality by extreme circumstances, such as testing a metal by putting it in fire, and refining quality by placing an object in extreme circumstances. David's companions may have thought he did not appreciate the urgency of the matter. Surely, if God were observing the siege, he would not have let it get to this point. But David has a different perspective on the present difficulties. The testing that the Lord carries out may actually constitute his care for the righteous rather than his neglect. The Lord refines the righteous person, but his soul hates the wicked person who loves violence. Fire refines precious metals, but it burns up and destroys impurities. This is the image for how the Lord uses difficulties to refine and purify the righteous, such that the difficulties are not judgment leading to destruction, but refining leading to well-being. That's only valid for the righteous, however. For the wicked, who love violence, difficulties are indeed judgment. This presents a significantly different perspective on the siege, or any troubles from enemies more generally. For the righteous, those troubles can be seen as a source of refining, rather than an indication that God has abandoned them. David sees even this present siege as refining, and therefore as something to be neither feared nor fled from, but something to be accepted as from God. Accepting difficulties as from God does not entail, however, ignoring the wickedness of those who cause them. With characteristic skill, David reverses the imagery of trapped birds, at first applied to himself, to now apply to his enemies. He indirectly asks God to trap the wicked as helpless birds. May he rain traps on wicked people, as in bird traps. Even more, may the portion in their cup be fire, brimstone, and a scorching wind. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is the prototypical case of judgment, in which God literally rained burning coals, fire, and brimstone from heaven in order to destroy the wicked cities. David calls for God to bring the same judgment on these wicked, but he changes the word coals ever so slightly to bird traps, turning his threatened end into their own. See our Poetic Features video for more details on this. Several psalms conclude with a final verse that recapitulates the message of the psalm, often casting the body of the poem in a slightly different light. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous acts. The upright people will look at his face. In verse 3, the righteous person was pitied as not having done anything to deserve the impending disaster, and the Lord's own righteousness was implicitly called into question. In verse 5, David insisted that the righteous person had no cause to complain, for difficulties were actually there for his benefit. Here, the Lord himself is poetically vindicated in that he is called righteous and one who loves righteousness. By this declaration, any doubts about his righteousness are shown to be unfounded. The question in verse 3 is thus answered. The righteous is undergoing the refinement that comes from a righteous God. The final line repeats the same Hebrew word in verse 4, in which the Lord's eyes observed humanity to be able to judge. Here, it is the upright who observe or look at the Lord's own face, as you might say, to look in his eyes. To look upon someone's face is to have the most intimate of social relationships, without any intermediary. The upright, having been observed and having passed the test, so far from being neglected and needing to flee, will be in intimate relationship with the Lord. Anyone looking on the Lord's face has no need of fear. Whereas the wicked in verse 5 loved violence, in verse 7, the Lord loves righteous acts and is known by the upright, which, in Hebrew, sounds very much like the word for wicked said backwards. The Lord's observing and testing undoes wickedness, leaving the upright, unhampered by their oppressors, to gaze in his face. And now, the complete text of Psalm 11. For the director, by David. I have sought refuge in the Lord. How can you say to me, flee to your mountain, birds? For look, the wicked people are about to bend the bow. They've put their arrows in place on the string, in order to shoot in deep darkness at the upright in heart. For the foundations are about to be destroyed. What has the righteous person done? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord, his throne is in heaven. His eyes observe. His eyelids test humans. The Lord refines the righteous person, but his soul hates the wicked person who loves violence. May he rain traps on wicked people. May the portion in their cup be fire, brimstone, and a scorching wind. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous acts. The upright people will look at his face. This has been the overview video for Psalm 11. Our aim is to present a single, coherent interpretation of the psalm. Our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views, and our poetic features video explores the distinctively poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more. Thank you.